My name is Chris Drozdowski. I'm with OriginLab Technical Support. I'll be conducting today's webinar on working with graph layers. All right, let's review a little bit before we get started some of the subjects we're going to talk about today in this webinar. First thing we're going to do is discuss the anatomy of a graph. Then we're going to look at examples of graphs with different layers. Then we're going to look at how we plot into graph layers. We have a few examples. We're going to look at adding new graph layers. Then we're going to discuss the relationship between multiple graph layers, their relationship. Then we're going to discuss managing graph layers, merging graph layers. We're going to talk about something you can't do with graph layers. It's an important point. Finally, we're going to talk about adjusting graph layers to a graph page, and I'll explain that term in a minute, and vice versa. And finally, I'll show you a couple improvements to layer management in upcoming Origin 2021 that should be released in late October of this year. I wanted to preface this by saying that the things I show you today, certainly it is not a full overview of graph layers. There are probably topics that I won't touch on. Also, some of the techniques I show you today, there are probably other ways to do them. There's not just usually in Origin, there's multiple ways to do anything you're trying to do. So bear with me if I show you perhaps a way that is not the most efficient. All right, let's look at the very first subject, the anatomy of an origin graph. And I feel that this is an important thing for people to be aware of. An origin graph, like the one you see below, I mean in front of you, it's annotated. It is a hierarchy of containers. That is, it's like one container containing another. And at the highest level in this origin graph, and this is what's called a graph window. This entirety of this unit here is a graph window. And at the highest level is what we call a graph page. The white area, the entire white area is the graph page. A graph page is a container for one or more graph layers. In the graph in front of you, the graph layer is the gray area. And some of this you may already know, but some people may not be aware of this hierarchy or these terms, so that's why I'm going through it. A graph layer is itself a container for 0 or more plots. You can actually have a graph layer that does not have any plots on it. I'll show you an example later today. Some of the features of an origin graph, specifically with a layer, is the first one is a layer icon. When you have for every layer in a graph, there's an icon in the upper left corner. And you can right click on that icon, and there's a context menu with many options, access to dialogues related to graphs, hiding layers and showing layers. So that is your layer icon. Next, usually associated with a layer is a legend. The legend is, generally speaking, legends are tied to layers. Furthermore, axes are tied to layers. Axes, for an origin graph, are at the layer level in the hierarchy. They aren't on their own level. They aren't at the plot level. They're at the layer level. So this is sort of that hierarchy of containers. It'll help you understand more about the subject. Now let's move on to different types. Let's look at some graphs with different numbers of layers, different layouts, multiple layers, single layers. In the first example, this is a single layer graph. We can see there's one set of axes, but it has multiple plots in it. So that's one type. Another type is this is actually actually a single layer graph. That is, there's my scatter plot and my fitted curve for the Arrhenius plot. But what I've done here is I needed a second independent axis that displayed different values. Instead of the temperature in kelvins, it displays a temperature in Celsius. So I added an empty layer to this graph for that secondary axis. Here is another This is a graph with multiple layers. There's 4 layers or panels. Each layer only has one plot. And we'll look at a couple more. Here is a multi-axis plot. This has multi-axis graph. This has 3 plots in it, each in its own layer, and the plots are on top of each other. Let me do a couple more. Here's an interesting graph. It's got a number of different types of layers. We can see that it has 2 line plot layers. It has an inset plot in this layer, and that inset is actually its own layer too. And it is a line plot. Finally, we have 4 layers that consist of contour plots. So this is a mixed plot graph. And last but not least is an OpenGL graph, a 3D OpenGL. 3D OpenGL graphs, generally speaking, you only have one layer in a graph for the OpenGL. But while you're restricted to one layer, you are not restricted in the number of plots in that layer. In fact, in this graph, we have one scatter plot. It's indexed color, but we have 3 different 3D surface plots. So this 3D graph with one layer has 2 different types of plots and a total of 4 plots. So those are some examples. Let's begin to look at how we can actually plot into layers. And we're going to look at a real basic thing in Origin right now. It's drag and drop plotting. So I have 3 books here. There's some exponential decay. There's an exponential decay data set in each of the books. And I want to plot them all onto the same graph. So there are different ways to do this, and this is one of the most efficient ways. So I'm going to select my XY column in the first book and go to the plot menu. Choose Basic 2D and Scatter. Now I want to add the data set from the next book and the data set from the other book to it. We could use the plot setup dialog, but in this case, all we have to do is select the Y column for that data set. And if you watch carefully, I'm going to move my mouse towards the right of that column until the mouse cursor changes. Then I can hold down my mouse button and just drag and drop that column right into my graph to add a second plot. And let me show you that again on this third one. I select the Y column. I move my mouse cursor down and towards the right of the column till it changes. I hold my mouse down and I drag and drop. Origin's prompting me to rescale the graph, which is fine. So now I have this 3 plots in a single layer, and I want to go ahead while I'm here. I want to group this. That's in Origin, within a given layer, you can have independent plots or grouped plots. So let's group this, and I will show you one of the ease of use tools that's in Origin for dealing with graphs, and that is the Object Manager. And it resides on the right side of the Origin user interface. It's in a tab. It may be hidden. If I mouse over the tab, the Object Manager pops up. Let me keep it open for now. And I see that hierarchy I talked about in it. There's like this tree view here, and at the highest level, I see graph 9, and that is the graph page. And then below it, I see layer 1, and that's the layer. And then under the layer, there are 3 different plots. Let's group these together, and this is an efficient way to do that. So I'm going to come to the first plot and right-click, and I'm going to choose Set as Group Begin. And when I do that, my plots have become a grouped plot, and I'm going to go ahead and slide Object Manager out of the way. Maybe I'll go ahead and close it back up, get a little more real estate. I can take this graph now and just real quick, let's change the color list associated with it. So I'm going to click on one plot. And in Origin 2020, our latest release, we have many toolbars. They are context-sensitive toolbars for working on graphs and worksheets. Almost everything has a mini toolbar, and in this case, we can click on the plot to see the plot mini toolbar. And one of the buttons on it lets us choose colors, the symbol edge color. And I'm going to just select a different color list. Maybe we'll select, let's choose the bold number 2. So that's how I got to plotting into a layer. Let's look at a more complex example. We're going to look at what we call a stat graph. I've got a worksheet with dose response data. There's 3 data sets here. And let's take a look at this. I'm going to click in to select this whole worksheet. By the way, this is X, Y, Y, Y data. I can click on the left corner to select the whole worksheet because I want to plot all the Y columns. And I'll go to plot. And we have a whole menu for multi-panel, multi-axis plots. These will be multiple layer plots. And the one I'm looking for is stack right here. It says a plot each data set in a separate layer using the stack template. So when I do that, I get a dialog to let me configure my graph. With this dialog, we can turn on an auto preview to see what we're building. And it's defaulted to 3 layers, one on top of the other. And it wants to give me a plot type. And I'm going to go ahead because maybe down the road, we're not going to do it today, but down the road, maybe we would do some nonlinear curve fitting on this dose response data. So I'm going to set it to a scatter plot. And we can see it update. And we have a number of settings for orientation, direction, layer order. Right now, the first layer is on the bottom, the second, the middle, the third on the top. Let's reverse that and put the first one on top. And we have other options here. I won't get too much into them, but we can actually, instead of having 3 plots and 3 layers, we could maybe change it and have 1 plot in one layer and 2 in another layer. So we can configure how plots get assigned to what layers here. But let's go ahead and click OK and look at our graph. So this is actually a rather popular form of graph. It's a stack. It is a stack plot. And we can customize and configure the layers. We can see on our layer icon that as we click inside a layer, not on a plot, but inside a layer, we see it's selected. We see our layer icon becomes depressed, indicating that's the active layer. By active, I mean that's the one that has focus. And I can click on the next one, select it. The active layer is switched. The layer icon switches. And with the third one, the same thing. Let's take a look at another form of multi-panel graph. This is going to be a vertical 2-panel. Let me move these assets out of the way. I have some enzyme data here. It's from an experiment. It's an XYY data set, so I have 2 data sets to plot here, and I'm just going to select the whole worksheet, and I'm going to go to plot, multi-panel axis, and select vertical 2-panel. So now we have a graph with 2 layers, 2 panels, each having 1 plot in it. We have some options here, as I mentioned, that legends are attached to layers, and we can see here that each layer has its own legend. You could actually, I won't do it now, but there's a way to combine them into one legend. So that's a different form of the multi-panel graph. Finally, let's look at another graph we can make. It's called a multi-axis graph. And this is what it's going to look like. This is actually a completely finished graph. I won't go and completely finish it like you see here, but we'll get most of the way to where the rest of it would just be styling it. So I'm going to start out in my worksheet. I have 3 columns, and I'm going to plot all 3 of them. 2 of them will be columns, and 1 will be a line plus symbol. So I'll select the whole worksheet. I will go to the plot menu, multi-panel or axis, and I will select this one, 3 Ys, Y-YY. So we start out, I initially get what I'm a 3-axis graph. It has 3 layers. These layers are stacked on top of one another. Each layer, all right, remember that the axes go with layers, so I have 3 sets of axes. The the first axis only shows the left side and the bottom. The other two layers show right axes, and they are linked together. All three layers are linked together by their x-axis. Well, the graph by default has come up as line plus symbol plots, but we can change that. We can actually come in and let me see which one is which. We want this dark gray one to be a column plot, and with our mini toolbar, we click one time on the plot, and we can come and change a plot to a column. Never mind that it's the color it is now. We'll correct that. For the red plot, that's also got to be a column. So again, I'll use my mini toolbar to come in, change a plot to a column. So we have the basic plotting done. Now we need to set some gaps and some offsets and maybe some colors. So I will double click on the graph. If you're familiar, if you've made graphs in Origin, you're familiar with this next dialog, the plot details dialog. We need to go to that highest, well, first let's look at that hierarchy similar to the one we saw in Object Manager. The graph page, layer plot, layer plot, layer plot. We want to go to that graph page level and go to a tab called Layers. There is a tab at the graph page level that lets us control layers. That gives us some controls for all the layers in a given graph. The one we're looking at right now, and for this graph, is we need column, bar, box, gap across layers. And when I select that and hit apply, we can see that those overlapping columns, which are still black, are now separated. While we're here, let's go ahead and change those colors. So I'm going to select the first plot under the first layer and just set its fill color to, let's set it to dark gray. For the next plot, let's set its fill color, this is a column plot, to like an orange. And hit apply, and we can see that we've now got our column styled. And let's just for the sake of completeness, let's change the symbol shape for the line plus symbol. Okay, and I'll say okay. And we've gotten most of the way to this finished graph here. One of the things we do need to do is we need to set that first layer, the scale, to start at 0. So let me go ahead and double click on the axis just to open the axis dialog. I'll select the vertical axis, and I'm just going to set that from to 0, and I'll say okay. So that is this is a very popular graph for presenting multiple data. That is a multi-axis graph, a good example of 3 layers. Now let's look at the concept of taking an existing graph and adding new layers to it. And the first one we're going to do is, if you remember back that Arrhenius plot here, we're going to go ahead and build about 3/4 of this plot. It'll be like last time. I'll build the important structure of it, but I won't take the time to style it too much. So let's get started. The easiest way, here's a little tip. Instead of starting this graph completely from scratch and adding the scatter plot and then adding the fitted curve to it, because we've done a linear fit, I can just copy the graph right out of the report. So I'll go to the report sheet for that linear fit, and I will scroll down to the fitted curve plot and double click on it to activate it, to bring it into focus. And what I will do is duplicate it now. In the window, I've got the top bar here, the title bar or caption bar, as some people call it. It has a right-click context menu, so I will right-click on it. And among the numerous things you can do, you can duplicate this window. So I've made an independent copy of this graph. I'm going to go ahead and park the copy I activated from the report sheet. And now I've got the first part of my graph, and I need to adjust. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my bottom tick labels. They're going to have what's called a divide by factor. So let me go ahead and double click on my x-axis, And I need to go to my tick labels, and I need to convert them from, I need to shift the decimal places, 3 places to the right. And the way I achieve that is I have this divide by factor. Essentially, what I need to do with these tick labels is multiply them by 1,000. But since we can only divide here, the way we would get to multiplication is just to say 1 over 1,000. So I'll say okay, and that adjusted our tick labels to be the correct magnitude. Now I want to go ahead and get ready to add. I need that second axis for the Celsius temperatures. And so to do that, I'm going to add an empty layer. And the way you add new layers to graphs, the way I'm familiar with, is to go to the Insert menu, New layer or axes. And we have a list here of all different kinds of layers we can have, mostly based on the axis, like a bottom X, left Y, a top X, a right Y. Some of them are linked. Here's an inset with data that's linked. There's even one that shows no axes. It's just an empty container, an empty layer container. We want this top X layer. So it's added you can see that, pardon me, let's undo that. I clicked on the wrong thing. Let's move that legend out of the way. In fact, let's go ahead and delete that. That's okay, we don't need it. Now we need to do a little bit of, we have to jump through some hoops to get these formulas right. And this takes a little bit of practice. I practiced before the webinar to make sure it was right. We have to add custom formulas, not only to the axis, but we have to add it to the layer in the plot details dialog. So I will double, and we can see notes here. By the way, I do put notes for my webinars. They help me remember things and are also useful. If you download the project file later, it helps you go through the project and make more sense of it. So we're going to double click on that top X layer to open the axis dialog. And we need to come to the horizontal scale tab and select the type of axis. And I'm going to choose a custom formula based axis. And then I need to enter these two formulas I've listed to the right. They're for converting from Kelvin to Celsius or inverse Kelvin to Celsius. So it's going to be 1 over, open parentheses, X, whatever a given X value is on that axis, plus 273.15. And now I need an inverse formula. Origin needs the inverse of that formula. So it's going to be parentheses 1 over X parentheses minus 273.15. So I can just click OK here. I've done that half of the custom formula, and it doesn't make any sense yet because we have to go into our plot details dialog and finish up. I'm going to go ahead and copy before I do that, so I don't have to take the time to type. I'm going to go ahead and copy out my next formula. And I will double click on the graph to open the plot details dialog. You can see the hierarchy here. We have a graph. Layer 1 does have 2 plots, the scatter and the fitted curve. The top X does not have a plot. Like I said, we can have layers without plots. And this layer is just serving as that conversion. We need to go to the link by selecting that top X layer. We now have on the right part of the dialog a link axis scales tab. And this tab lets us specify how we are linking that top X layer to layer number 1. We have options. We can link the X axis and or the Y axis. In our case, we don't need to link the Y axis, but we do need to link the X axis. We have options: straight 1-to-1, align, which I actually, to be frank, I'm not sure about, but we have a custom formula, and I'm going to paste that formula I copied from my notes window in there, if it lets me. Yes. And I need to paste it again. We have 2 things here, X1 and X2. X1 represents the initial value on that horizontal axis, and x2 represents the final value. So I'm going to paste those two formulas and modify x1 to x2 here and hit apply. And when I do this formula, I now see those the corresponding Celsius temperatures correctly lined up. So that's how I built the backbone of this Arrhenius plot using an empty layer. Let's take a look at another graph we can create by adding new layers. We're going to manually build one of those multiple axis plots, a double Y plot. I want to build it by using the magnetic field column from trial run number 1 sheet and the magnetic field column from trial run 2 sheet. So let's start by just selecting that first column in the first sheet, and we're going to create a line plot. I'll go to plot, basic 2D, line. Now I want to add a second layer on top of this one. We're going to link the x-axes. So we need to go to the insert menu, go to new layer. I want a right Y, it's going to display the axis on the right, and a linked X scale and dimension. So now we can see we have two layer icons. We've got the right axis. That means we've got these two layers on top of each other now. Now we can re-employ what we learned about drag and drop plotting to go ahead and just drag that second magnetic field into that new layer. I will click on the layer icon in my graph, number 2. That's the layer we want to drag to. If I click on it, it activates that layer. It makes it receptive to drag and dropping. So I will select that magnetic field column. Remember, we move our mouse to the right, to the right, to the right, till the cursor changes, and we drag it and drop it. And it wants to rescale, sure, why not? So now we have two plots in 2 different layers. They're both black right now. We could change that. We could perhaps change this top layer. Let's see which. That's layer 1. Maybe we want to change layer 2. Let's use the mini toolbar to change the line color. Let's make it oh, maybe like an olive green. Maybe make the line thicker just so it'll show up. And I'll make this other line thicker too, just so it'll show up for you. Now, the way I would like to know which scale applies to which graph is by color. And the green plot is associated with this right y-axis. Pardon me. So I'm going to double click on that axis. And in the axis dialog, I can go to the vertical axis line and tick tab. And I'm going to change the line color to auto, which means it's picking up on the color from the plot. And when I say OK, I now have a green axis to match my green plot. So that's how, using adding a layer, we manually constructed a multi-axis plot. And let's take a break from creating graphs. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between multiple layers in a graph. And we have a couple of examples. We have a rather complex example here. It is 4 panels or 4 layers, and each panel has its own inset plot, which is a layer unto itself. So on this graph, and we're going to learn how to make this somewhat. This is from merging separate graphs. But we see this. We have this relationship of sort of a parent layer and a child inset layer, and we have 4 of those. We also want to pay attention to how our plots are. They have an order in how they're presented on the graph. If we click, as we click through, starting on the top left, we can see our plot icon change. So we know that's our first layer, our second layer, our third layer, our fourth layer, and so on. I'll show you a little trick. This isn't very well known, but we can more easily visually establish what layer is what by going to our view menu, going down to show, and choosing axis layer icons. And when we do that, Origin puts these little square icons on all the axes. And then we can follow through with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You'll see this a little more later, but we also have front to back stacking. For example, on those multi-axis graphs, those are stacked up from front to back, and we'll look at changing the stacking order a little bit later. We've already talked about linking, how you can link axes between different layers. Like we've done a few times. We've seen how the x-axis gets linked together. Finally, another relationship is the size and the position on a graph page compared to each other. And let's double click on the plot setup, plot details dialog to look at that. We have a bunch of layers here. We can look at the layer level, each one has a size tab. This lets us, we have different units. It lets us start with a left and a top and then work width and height. And we can specify it in different units. For example, the first layer is in percent of page. But we may look at a next layer and let's see what unit it is. It is actually, because this third layer is linked to layer 1, it does have linking. Its layout is relative as a percentage to the linked layer. So the layers they have different relationships. And because of that linking and because of that sizing, on this particular graph, when I drag around one layer, the others move with it. We will learn how we can turn that off a little bit later. So let's look at our next topic today. By the way, I forgot to mention, if you have any questions, we have a Q&A window. My colleagues are listening in and they will help you if you have any questions. Let's look at how are we going to manage these layers. We've created these graphs with multiple layers, but what if we need to manage them? Let's take, for example, this graph. It's got 4 layers, 2 plots each, 4 panels. I want to adjust the layout on this, maybe make them smaller and adjust where they go. So I'll select this very first plot. I'm going to make it smaller. It's too crowded on the graph. So let me make that a little bit smaller. I can now make all the other layers / panels the exact same dimensions using one of our built-in toolbars. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and just multi-select the other 3 layers. So now all 4 layers are selected. And I can go to the Object Edit toolbar. It's sort of kind of hidden away on the right lower part of Origin, but it's really useful. And 2 of the buttons are Uniform Width and Uniform Height. So when I click those, it is going to adjust so all 4 panels have the same width and height. Now let's move around a little more. I've done that. Let's adjust a little bit more. I'm going to slide that layer up, and just to show you an example of what I'm trying to do, I'm aligning the layers. I'm just going to move this one out of the way. But let's say we now have this upper left panel where we want it. We want to align the other layers with it. So let's go ahead and, holding the Shift key down, I'm going to select that layer and the layer below it. And I'm going to go back to that Object Edit toolbar. And we have a button, Left Alignment. And I'll click that. And they're both aligned now vertically. Then I'm going to select the first layer and a layer next to it. And I'm going to go to the Top Alignment button. So I've aligned them. Next, I'm going to align this layer and this layer. I need to align their tops. So I can do that. And finally, I need to align these 2. So I did this to show you how useful this toolbar is over here. I'll align them to the left. So now we've done a quick custom adjustment using that toolbar rather than having to open a dialog and entering numeric values for these offsets. I just chose to do it visibly. Now, if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I'm going to adjust this graph because I want to show you how we can move panels around, how we can swap their positions. So let me double click on to open the plot details dialog. And I need to check at the graph level, the graph page level, I need to go to the layers tab because we have this common display feature in Origin. The common display lets you, on a multi-panel graph, it lets you change certain aspects of the graph, like a plot color, and that will be reflected in all layers on the graph, or the axis style, and it will cascade to other layers. And we'll see if we can take a look at that in just a minute. But I want to go ahead and turn off these common display. And I'm going to make each of these layers, I'm going to give it a unique background color so we can see what happens when we swap. I'll start with the first layer, set a background color, just some light color, apply. It doesn't really matter. We're not publishing this graph. It doesn't really matter what these colors are. Let me choose the next one, and one final one, and say okay. So we have our different colors for our layout. What I want to do is I want to swap the positions of these layers. Let me go ahead and turn on the axis layer icons, just so we can see we have layer 1, next to it layer 2, next row is layer 3, and one beside it is 4. And we're going to open a completely different dialog, one that you may not use very often in Origin. I myself rarely use it. We're going to choose the layer management icon, and we can actually open it from our layer icon on the graph by right-clicking it in the context menu. Choose layer management. And bear with me. Now this dialog can be a little bit overwhelming. It pretty much can do everything you'd ever want to do to a layer in this one dialog, and it is a little bit overwhelming. But let's use it to swap out some of these, to swap layers here. Let's say I want to swap layer 3 and layer 2. I want to reorder them. It is as simple as going to the Arrange tab. No, pardon me, which one is it? It is the Size Position tab. You see, there's a lot going on here. I have options I can specify here. If I wanted, like I just resized them visually, I could resize it now numerically. I can move them, doing the same idea from a dialog, aligning them, but I want to swap them. And when I choose swap under the size position tab, it asks me which layers, the first layer and the second. So I'm going to say I want to swap layer 2 with layer 3, and I don't want to reorder them. I don't want to do that. And I'm going to hit the apply button and look at my little preview here, and I see that they swapped. So that's how you swap layers. That can be very useful in a multi-panel plot. Recently, I had a customer who could not, their graph had maybe 20 layers in it, and they needed to swap them around. And we showed them about using the layer management. So that's swapping layers. Now let's take a look at another feature. We talked about that stacking one on top of each other. Let's look and see how we can change that. This is very similar to the graph, the multi-axis graph we created. However, our line plus symbol plot, because of how I created this, ended up behind my column plots, and it's not very useful at all. So I want to pull it forward. And there's a complication, though, that will break my axis linking. So we're going to go back to our layer icon, right click, and we're going to use layer management again to do this. And in our layer management, we're going to focus on this left side, this list of layers and the buttons. And I happen to know, because I see my axis layer icons over here, that the blue plot is layer 1, and I want to pull it down the list. So I'm going to do that. Drag and drop it to reorder it. This is telling me I'm breaking the linking, and I'm just going to say okay, because we can relink here from this dialog. So I pull that one on top, My other two are okay. And let's see how we need to do linking. Layer two links to layer one, which is okay. Because when I drag that, the layers got renamed. In this case, layer one is always the bottom layer. And I took the old layer one and brought it up, and it became layer three. It gets a little complicated. But I need to link this layer three to layer one. So I will select it here, go to my link tab, and link to layer one, and we'll set our x-axis link to 1 to 1. And we'll apply it to see how it looks in our preview. And we achieved the effect we wanted. We pulled that plot from the back forward, and we did our relinking so the axes worked properly. So those are the basics of managing layers, adjusting the size of the layers and their alignment, swapping positions, and changing their stacking order in a sense, front to back. Now let's look at another topic associated with layers, and that's merging graphs. We've seen this graph before. I told you we would revisit it. We want to create this merged graph from 4 independent graphs here. Each graph is made up of 2 layers. One is the main layer and one is the inset layer. So let's go ahead. I'm going to just take this graph and delete it because we don't need it, and it will make the merging a little bit harder. And I will go to let me activate a graph, activate it, bring it in focus, graph menu, go to merge graph windows, and I have options here about what graphs do I want to merge. I could do the active, I don't know why we have, I guess active page would add it to the list, or I can choose all in the active folder, the current folder we're working in. There's various recursive folders, all in the project. No way, we don't want to do that. The very last one I want to point out, because this gets overlooked, we just have these 3 dots here. And I'm going to click on that. And what that does is that's bringing up a dialog letting us manually choose the plots we want. So I happen to know that I do want graph 56 through 59. I probably should have looked at their short names beforehand, but let me just hold down the shift key and multi-select and click the arrow buttons. Well, wait, we want to, and move them over to the right. So these are going to be the graphs I want to merge, and I'll say okay. And we get another dialog. It's similar to that stacked graph dialog that we saw earlier, in that it lets me specify things like number of rows and columns. We want 2 rows and columns. We have a number of add extra layers for grid, keep aspect ratio, a lot of settings. I don't need to go through them right now. Treat each source as a graph unit. I don't want to link these because I want to be able to manually adjust them. If I link them together, it's going to make it more complicated if I want to manually adjust the positions, like I just did a few minutes ago. And we have some other settings that aren't so important, many settings in here. I want to add a label for each of these merged graphs. So I'm going to choose for label text, custom, and I need to remember how to do this. I'm going to say sample, and you won't remember this today. I'm just showing you. I need to say sample in $. And where do I want it? I want it on the top left hand side. And I get a preview here so I can see what I'm going to get before I click OK. So we don't have to jump through this whole dialog again. And I will say OK. And here is our merged graph that I just showed you. So that's another way of working with layers. It's to merge them together. And of course, I won't do too much, but I can just drag them about. And actually, because the inset is linked to the parent layer, the inset will move with it, which is good. And that's also, there was a setting in the merge graphs dialog for treating each graph as a unit. This allowed me to do that. And by not linking them, this gave me the freedom to drag them, to position them, to resize them visually. All right. We are going to take a moment because we have a poll we would like you to participate in. If you will take time to participate and answer these questions, it will help us very much. It helps us make future decisions about webinars. Our customers' opinions are very important at OriginLab. You have great influence not only over what webinar content or the quality of the webinar, you have a lot of control over future features in Origin. We take feature suggestions from customers very seriously. So I'm asking you just to take a couple minutes here, and I'll just stop for a minute or two, and then I'll move on. I hope the information I presented today helps you understand the concept of a graph layer better. My primary focus was just having you understand the nature of a layer. I did not want to get too deep into every option there was possible. I promise you, I probably only covered 50% of all the features or the information related to layers, but I think I provided enough to give you a good understanding. All right, let's go ahead and let's give it another minute or two because I just have a couple more topics and then we can move on. Okay, I guess while you finish up your poll, and I'll go slowly now, I'll move on to another topic, and if you miss this topic, it's not a big deal because it's something you can't do, but people rarely ask for it. I have an OpenGL graph here, a 3D OpenGL graph, and I have an area, a stacked area graph, which is a 2D graph. I want to merge these together. So let's see what happens when we try that. I'll go to Graph, Merge Graph Windows, and I'll open the dialog. And Origin immediately says to me, I have a warning at the bottom, OpenGL-based 3D graphs cannot be used in multi-layer graphs, and they'll be excluded from merging. That is the can't do this. You cannot have a multi-layer graph where one of the layers is 3D OpenGL. 3D OpenGL is limited to one layer per graph. If you remember at the beginning of the webinar, we're limited to one layer per graph, but you can't have multiple plots in the layer. The workaround for this is to use what's called a layout page. So I will come up to my toolbar on the top left. I forget the name of this toolbar, but I'll scroll over till I hit the new layout button and I'll click that. A layout is it's sort of like a graph, but it's more of a container for visual images because we're going to place images of these graphs into the layer. And the way I will do that is I will right click on this layout and I will add a graph, and I'm going to add that 3D graph first. Okay. And I need to drag it out. There's my 3D. Now let's add the stacked area 2D graph. Add graph. And we'll add that one. Drag it out. And then I can adjust it, align it, that sort of thing. So that's how you would overcome that limitation of not being able to have multiple layers with the OpenGL graphs. Let's look at one last subject before we look at a couple of improvements in the next version of Origin, adjusting layers to a page and vice versa. All right, we'll start with this graph. I've laid it out, and I'm interested in my page, this whole white area. Remember, that's the graph page. I want the graph page to be adjusted to fit the layer. I don't want to. I could go into my plot details dialog and enter numbers there, but for simpler graphs such as this one, we have a handy feature in Origin. We can go to the graph menu and choose fit page to layers. A little dialog will pop up, and you can leave the default setting. There's like a border width that's going to give you a padding. We'll leave it in the default value, and we can say how do we want to adjust it by height and width or height and width only. Some complications, but if we just click OK, we can see the origin. Did it not adjust it real well? Let's try it again. You can do it multiple times. Bit page to layers. It did not get it as well as I thought it would, but it did it. Yeah, it did it with the it did add the border. Let's look at the other one, and this is a new graph type in Origin. This is a correlation ellipse matrix. And what we want to do in this case is we actually want to adjust this layer to fit the graph page, the white area. So we'll use the corresponding tool from the graph menu. Fit layers to page, and it's got a slightly different controls. It wants to give you a percent of page margin size. So, let's choose 5% and click OK. So it adjusted out. It made it bigger. We could adjust it again. Maybe I've got too much of a margin there. Fit layers to page. Maybe let's just have 1% and say OK. So those are quick ways to adjust pages to layers and layers to pages. Now let's look at one last subject today, and that is improvements in Origin 2020. And if you'll bear with me a minute, I will open our the latest beta release. We're in the beta release stage of Origin 2020 right now. So I will open that up. If anything funny happens while it's running, that's because it's beta software. So let me come in, open 2020. There's some interesting things in 2020. We now have a formula bar similar to Excel, but not exactly the same. That's going to be a good feature. But I will go to the File menu, go to Recent Projects, and I'm going to open that same project. And it's telling me it's open in another version of Origin, so it's a read-only file. That's okay. So let's go down to Improvements in Origin 2020. And I have two. I'm going to show you two today. We have a third improvement involving placing images in layers. I don't have a working example of that, so I can't show that to you. But I can show you these other two ease of use features. I've got a single layer here with a single plot. It's stuck in the upper left corner. I can restrict how I move it when I move it with a mouse. I can always just move it like this. But what if I want to be a little more careful and restrict it? I can hold down the Shift key, and then when I drag to the right, it only moves horizontally. Or if I drag up and down, it only moves vertically. So that helps us like not accidentally move it the wrong way. We have another feature. Remember I said we had our mini toolbars in Origin? Well, we not only have a plot mini toolbar, or a layer level mini toolbar right here. If we move our mouse out to the right on our graph page, close to the edge, we can see the mouse cursor change to where it looks like there's a little tiny toolbar there. That is a page level toolbar, and we actually have those in Origin 2020, just not as many features. Let me bring that back. We have a feature here where we can center layers on page. So that's a quick way to just get that layer centered on the page. All right, I'm going to shut down 2020. I think we are about done. If you'll give me a moment just to do a quick review. If you'll remember, we talked about the anatomy of a graph. I showed you examples of different types, different layers in graphs. We plotted into layers, and I introduced you to drag and drop plotting. It's very handy once you're used to it. We looked at adding new layers to graphs, including that Arrhenius plot where we had that top X layer that was just used for a new axis. We talked about the relationships between multiple layers. We discussed managing layers and merging graphs. We talked about how you can't have the OpenGL multiple layers. We talked about adjusting layers to page and vice versa. And finally, I showed you those improvements that are coming up in 2021. I appreciate you taking the time with us today to watch this webinar. We will hang out for a little bit in case any questions or comments come up. And have a good afternoon.